The following is a presentation from the College of Charleston for South Carolina ETV and the SC Channel.
Yes.
Because it's a sculpture, it's not really a house.
You've heard it said, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. What the person usually means is they like what they know. The more frequently we encounter something, the more inclined we are to like it. Most people are comfortable with what they know, whether it's a neighborhood, a way of preparing food, or a shortcut home. Whether we know it or not, we're all shaped by the repeated exposure effect. The more familiar something becomes, the more comfortable we become with it, sort of like an acquired taste. Hello, my name is Marc Sloan, and welcome to State of the Arts. On today's program, we're going to be talking with 3 artists and a curator. My hope is that in these conversations you will be able to expand your definition of art or what you think art might be. Today's guests all have ties to the arts in South Carolina Lowcountry. They create challenging works in a variety of media. And while it doesn't take long to acquire a taste for their work, they are each unorthodox in some way. We also want to introduce you to a new world of contemporary art, where your very definition of art may be challenged. Those of you who think you don't like abstract or contemporary art might just enjoy this part best. Contemporary art may be an acquired taste for most, but for some, it's an enduring passion. New York-based painter Brian Rutenberg is a native of the South Carolina Lowcountry and is best known for his dynamic interpretations of landscapes. Brian credits much of his inspiration to the scenic surroundings of his lowcountry childhood. His unconventional use of color and his abstract depiction of the natural world have earned the artist critical acclaim and an international following. Brian received his undergraduate degree in studio art from the College of Charleston and holds a master's degree from New York's School of Visual Arts. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Marc.
Thanks for being on the program.
My pleasure.
I'd like to talk with you a little bit about your work and about your approach to painting. And I thought we would start by talking about your work as representational, or to what degree do you think your work is representational versus abstract?
The drawings I do are representational, but they are by no means studies for the paintings. I do realistic drawings of trees, still lifes, and figures, but the paintings are much more subversive than that, and there's a lot more exploring going on in the paintings. I see myself as fitting probably right in the middle between abstraction and representation, sometimes with a tick more to abstraction. But if we look at painters like 19th century painters like Friedman, for example, you can see that the landscape is as much about who you are on the inside as it is about what you're looking at on the outside. And that's inspiring to me, and I think my approach to landscape is much more of an internal one.
What do you, when people look at your paintings, would you like for them to be able to know what your painting is of, say the Edisto River or something like that? Would you like for it to be recognized as that source?
Not at all. I think I use that only as a jumping off point, as a starting point. I was born and raised along coastal South Carolina and educated here in Charleston, and my imagination was formed here. And it's been my muse ever since, and probably always will be. So I'm very inspired by this place. It's a very robust and full of poetic images. But the paintings explore other things as well.
So if I were looking at something like this out here, how to translate into paint, you would first look at overall at the color, and you would think the Stono River in August, so hot. Everything is cool colors though, cool greens, grays, raw umber, magenta, pale blues in the distance. Beautiful. So you think of temperature first. Mm-hmm. And I do plan that way in the paintings, which are more abstract but still have elements of this at play. I also look for, like, there's a diagonal across here, different pictorial elements that will that will construct the picture and make it interesting and bring the viewer into the painting as well.
Are you able to flatten the space as you look at it? Can you
Yeah.
look at a three-dimensional view and
always.
translate it to a painting?
Always.
It must be like a film director being able to have that little...
Precisely. That little world within the fingers.
When you were a child, did you spend time going into the marshes and the tidal creeks and that sort of thing? Were you a child of nature in a sense, or?
Yeah, we did. We had a creek down the street from where we lived, and we spent a great deal of time in Myrtle's Inlet, which is just south of Myrtle Beach, in little boats, clamming and fishing.
And the light and that sort of thing is
the
sort of...
light, very complex light. Very poetic light, and very unique to this part of the country.
And do you use that kind of, that's the memory of that, is that something that fuels you to this day? Is that your upbringing is, I guess you can't step outside of yourself to know what it would be like without that, but
No.
But that's an ongoing source.
That's an ongoing thing, and that's where, again, I acknowledge my imagination as have being formed there. My job as a painter is to be an inventor and not to be a recorder. So I've got to go beyond, just rendering. The drawings can render. The paintings have to go, be more subversive, I think, than that. We've been in the same studio, myself and 4 other artists, rent a space in Tribeca in Lower Manhattan, and we have about 500 square feet each. So it's a terrific room. Again, it faces an inner courtyard, and I like controlled even light. I don't like a lot of natural light. And I get there about 10 and prepare for that day's work. I have correspondence, I have a computer there and everything. And then I start to, just to reconnect with what I had been doing the night before. I love color. I love mixing color and learning about color. And one of the ways to do that, which is, again, why I moved to New York, was to have access to the museums, to art history. That teaches me a lot. I have a lot to learn, but I really work hard at it. The paintings are not about trying to evoke memory or nostalgia or to relive some experience or place. They're meant to be an experience or a place in themselves, something totally new, something a little more intense and something a little more over the top than actual real life, which is what painting can do, I think, sometimes. It can change the way you see the world. It can offer something that's even more spectacular than what's real. That way, when you go back to the real world, you might have a, maybe a more sensitive, appreciation of things. It's my hope.
How do you know when it's done?
A friend of mine has it's rather abstruse, but it makes perfect sense to me, and I'll just share it with you. Almost that you can start with the painting and it's opaque. Not physically, but conceptually, it's opaque. It's impenetrable. And when you work through it and work through it and work through it, and eventually when it becomes transparent is when it's finished. When you can actually see and have something come back to you, your gaze, when it no longer feels like a brick wall, when it feels like something that's malleable or porous. That. And also, I just, from 25 years or so of doing it, I just know when it's finished.
So sometimes you probably had to, in your past, take it a little too far before you knew.
Absolutely. And I've never been afraid to go too far. That's one of the bits of advice I would always give groups when I speak to them, is don't be afraid to put yourself in the position to make mistakes and go too far.
Well, thank you very much for coming and speaking with us today, and I look forward to seeing more of your work in the future.
Thanks, Mark.
Mixed media artist Joe Walters hails from Kentucky. His childhood experiences growing up in the Appalachian foothills nurtured an interest in natural history that continues to inform his work. Since moving to Charleston in 1995, he has increasingly included the flora and fauna of the South Carolina Lowcountry into his work. Joe has exhibited extensively, with recent solo shows at Solomon Projects Atlanta, Bernice Steinbaum Gallery in Miami, and the Jacksonville Museum of Modern Art. His works are seen in the Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas City and the U.S. Embassy in Istanbul. Joe, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here.
Thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about your work and the nature of your work. And your work could be said to be about nature and scientific observation from the viewer's point of view. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about where your work comes from and what you perceive it to be about.
Well, those things certainly are true. A lot of my work is based on observations of phenomena in the natural world, and of course, given it my own interpretation in the way that it's formatted and made and created and put together. There is, I guess, a natural science component but that's not entirely it. I'd like to feel like there are other layers that are behind that, or other undercurrents that are involved as well.
To some people, you might seem to be a sort of a schizophrenic artist in that you work in two separate yet related media. You make sculptural installations, and you make drawings that are often also in installation format. And I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about your sculptural work and how you approach that, and sort of how that part of your work has evolved. Where did it begin, and where is it now?
Well, the way I'm working now is in a very eccentric mixed media area, using unorthodox materials and means to create the work that I do, and that applies not only to the sculpture but the drawing as well. I guess in my early days of my career, I was doing a lot of metal casting, a lot of welding, and more conventional approaches to sculpture, and then started to feel encumbered by technical means at a certain point, and started experimenting with mixed media, which I'd always done off and on anyway, and finally came to a way of working that I could do without having to have a specific type of studio or foundry equipment or welding equipment and that sort of thing. So it's a very effective, very efficient, and hopefully at times a very elegant way of working, and it's something that's very satisfying to me. But the way the three-dimensional work is made is currently is with a brazed wire armature or skeleton for the figures, and then there's aluminum mesh that's modeled over top of that, and then a polymer clay pressed into the aluminum, goes through a baking process, and then there's glue and sand applied, which creates a sandy texture, of course, and then several applications of paint, usually iron oxide derived pigments that create the somewhat of an illusion of the things being corroded metal. And it also, the incrustation also puts them in somewhat of an archaeological context. I like to refer to it as a Pompeii-like archaeological context, as if the figures were sort of frozen in an instant.
So Joe, you're creating a little bird there. Is it any bird in particular, or is it, it looks to me like a whippoorwill or something, but what are your thoughts? Do you try to make it into a specific kind of bird, or?
No, not really. It's, for some reason, that would kind of take a lot of the fun out of it. I think the things that are very approximate, and I always like to say they're not species specific, and they could have characteristics of several different individual species all rolled into one. So this particular skeleton of a bird is, to me, it has proportions that are similar to a mockingbird. I'm sure many others, but no, they're not species specific at all.
I see. But if you have a collector who says that's a whippoorwill, then
that's fine.
That's a whippoorwill.
Yeah. It can be anything you want it to be.
So we're looking at some of your drawings here, Joe, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where the imagery comes from for these.
The imagery comes from, reflected images in water, of which there's a lot of here in the Low Country of South Carolina, and I spend a good bit of time on the water. This series, of which there are about a dozen more, were made, or the inspiration came from being on a kayak in the salt marsh off Folly Beach, and observing at high tide, and observing some of the reflections of individual stalks of the marsh grasses, and it was very striking to me, and just for the abstraction of it, and of course this radical symmetry, and also I think people have pointed out they also have associations with insect diagrams and things of that nature. So I like the abstract qualities, and also the fact that it can have multiple readings or multiple associations.
So in a sense, they're like Rorschachs. You can project onto them.
Yes.
Now, I know that you enjoy being an artist, but if you could choose for a day or a week a fantasy occupation, what might that be?
That's a good question. I probably would like to be to have a comic strip. You know, I think that would be a fun thing to do.
Well, Joe, thanks so much for being here today, and I enjoyed talking with you, and I look forward to seeing more of your work.
Thank you.
Chicago-based author and independent curator Mary Jane Jacob has revolutionized the way art is presented. Her site-specific, community-based programs have taken contemporary art out of the museums and into the streets, placing it before a newer, broader audience. Her most prominent exhibitions include Places with a Past for the Spoleto Festival USA, Culture in Action, a public art program for Sculpture Chicago, and the Evoking History program, also for Spoleto Festival USA. Welcome to the show, Mary Jane. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Well, as a curator who works inside a white cube, such as myself, I'm always interested in learning more about curators such as yourself who work outside of the framework of a museum or gallery. And you've had a long-standing engagement with the city of Charleston. But I'd like for you to talk a little about your engagement with projects that happen outside of museums.
Well, I began in museums, and I worked there for quite some time because that was the place where curators practiced and where artists showed their work. But I'm very happy to say that that is not the whole landscape of viewing art today, and that there is, in a way, a role that I hope I've played and Charleston has played in that by showing that today artists make work that is generated by a dialogue of ideas, and sometimes those ideas are evoked by a place that becomes the inspiration for their art that exists temporarily in location rather than in a museum.
Could you talk a little bit about Charleston as a kind of canvas for your various curatorial engagements?
Well, Charleston as a city also had artists from the beginning, whether they were making maps or making naturalist drawings, later making literature, poetry, and that's part of its history that we think is its past, and that in more recent times it's been a place where art has presented itself. The Spoleto Festival, with which I work, is one of those situations that brings art in and also allows other art to be seen. But I think that Charleston also is a place that we've explored as being at the same time extremely formative in the kind of art that we're talking about today, and the art which has become identified with this place. It's a place which is rich in history, and that history isn't forgotten. It exists on the street, it exists in historical monuments, it exists very much in the memory of people in all walks of life.
Could you talk a little about what you perceive as a change, if there is one, between the audience and the receptivity of the audience during your exhibition Places with a Past and then your return in 2001 with Evoking History Project?
Well, I can say from the very beginning of doing this kind of work, which was rooted in site, which we sometimes call site-specific art or installation art on location, the audience was really pretty receptive. It might have had certain aspects that challenged them or that they questioned, but I think that for so many people who came to that exhibition in 1991, it was a place where they also saw themselves. They saw aspects of their own lives, or in empathetic ways, the lives of other people. What happened when we started again in 2001 was to say, let's work more directly with people. Let's work more directly with their lives in the present day. And I can say in part we were inspired by the work of David Hammons.
As we walk around this house, Mary Jane, what do you think the questions are that David Hammons is posing to this community with this project?
Well, this house is actually a sculpture. We see a door, we see something that looks like a house, but we can't occupy it. Nobody can live here. It's too small, and it's actually shut. There's no way to enter it. We're kept out of the house. And maybe in one way he's talking about how we're kept out of the houses that we feel that we can occupy and the places where we used to live and where are people able to live today.
this door that appeared here in the year 2001. I was very curious about this, and I understand this is your work. What is this about?
When I looked around me and I saw all of the things that's been going on, I figured that a door represents an opportunity if it's open properly, and it can be vice versa if the right thing's not in that door once you enter the door.
One of the things that this kind of work in location really puts us in a mindset to see is that there are many different communities. So for the community which is part of the east side of Charleston, it's a part of their everyday landscape. For the community which is the tourist community and that which operates that industry here, it's become another tourist attraction. So now tour buses go through there, which they never did before. There's people crossing boundaries which would otherwise be, while invisible, nonetheless very strong.
Thank you, Mary Jane. That was great. And I always look forward to your exhibitions, and I look forward to seeing more of your projects here in Charleston.
It will happen.
Good. Thanks. College of Charleston art professor Herb Parker has been producing nature-based art for over 20 years. Using clay, sand, sod, and other earthen materials, the North Carolina native has produced over 40 large-scale installations featured in parks and gardens throughout the U.S. and in Canada, Italy, and Japan. According to the artist, these environmental installations evolved from a theory of the workings of natural systems in time. A former Peace Corps volunteer and U.S. Marine, Herb holds a Master of Fine Arts degree from East Carolina University. Welcome to the program, Herb. Today we'd like to talk a little bit about your nature-based art. I know that you've created dozens of these earthworks around the world, including Japan and Europe, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little about your evolution, the evolution of the formal ideas involved in these. You've moved towards temple forms and almost like sanctuaries, it seems to me, and then of course the labyrinth piece that you did for Piccolo Spoleto this past year.
The work has evolved over time. Initially, a lot of it was very geometric, and partly because of the way I was working, the materials I was using. But as over time, one work leads to the next work, and the work has softened and has become more organic, and really the forms are distilled from nature, at least the more recent ones. But they still have a reference to architecture.
Yes, you're driving me crazy. What did I do? What did I do?
Well, we're here with Herb Parker in his studio, and seems to me it's a wonderful cabinet of curiosities as well. And I know that you produce two different kinds of work in this space, Herb, and I wanted to talk a little bit about both of them. One of the things you do here is to create works that lead up to your large monumental outdoor pieces, and then you also produce a brand of personal work. So I'd like to talk about both, but let's start with what goes on here for making a large outdoor piece.
Yeah, I do models or maquettes for the some of the large outdoor pieces.
Like this?
Yeah, this is one for a project in North Carolina at the Zoological Park there. And it was one that I would have had a trouble doing it in a drawing format because I didn't really understand what I wanted to do with it. So by building a model, that was probably the fourth version of that particular piece before I actually came to the point where I liked it.
Mm-hmm. What about this one here?
That was one for an amphitheater project that was, I think, 1999 or 2000, somewhere in there. And it was a large earth structure with seating and changing rooms inside. And, but right when they were starting to raise the money for this one, they had a hurricane and destroyed. It had 10 acres on a river, and it destroyed their art center and flooded their. Oh. So that project disappeared quickly.
Are there specific things that you look for when you're scouting a location for one of your pieces? Say you're commissioned to do a piece. What are some of the things that go through your mind as you try to figure out what the best site might be.
Because partly is I like a sense of mystery if I can, but often I don't have the choice. The site is determined before I'm brought in on board, and then if I do have any choices, it's a matter of often logistics of being able to get to the site without doing any damage to the site.
Well, could we shift gears and talk a little bit about some of your other work, and if you could tell a little bit about what you're thinking behind these other pieces, your studio sculpture work?
The objects tend to be, I actually spend probably most of my studio time on the objects. I really enjoy making things, and have been making objects for 30, 35 years now, and long before I was working on the outdoor pieces, I was making things, and I probably always will, because I get I guess I get probably irritable if I don't get some object, play with objects and put things together, and it's a way of for me to understand what I'm going through in life and kind of work through my I guess it's therapy probably, work through my problems.
Well, thank you very much for this tour. It was great talking to you.
Well, thanks for dropping by.
I hope you enjoyed learning more about the state of contemporary art in South Carolina. I'd like to thank my guests, Mary Jane Jacob, Joe Walters, Herb Parker, and Brian Rutenberg. If you find yourself in Charleston, please stop by the Halsey Gallery on the College of Charleston campus. We'd love to see you. For State of the Arts, I'm Marc Sloan.